I'm Susanna Marsden, a higher education consultant who helps to develop and support HE institutions in the UK and beyond. This podcast takes a deep dive into the roles of people who work in this hugely varied higher education sector. Each episode reveals what's involved in a specific role, the career path that led to it, and tips on how to get in and get on in these jobs. My guests in this episode are Kerry Shepherd and Ben Tucker, founders and partners of the executive search firm Minerva, sponsor of this Leadership Reflections miniseries. In our discussion, we explore some of the themes from earlier episodes of the miniseries and put those topics in the wider higher education leadership context of 2025. As professionals who have contact with a significant number of institutions and leadership candidates, Kerry and Ben also share their observations of the leadership qualities that are now being sought, as well as consideration of how emerging leaders can be supported through development programmes to best support the future leadership of higher education. Kerry, Ben, welcome to the podcast and thanks for being my guests in this final episode of the Leadership Reflections mini-series. We're going to pick up on some of the themes coming out of the series in a few moments, but I'm keen to ask you first a bit about Minerva. You established the company back in 2013, having each worked in the search profession in other organisations. Can you say a bit more about the specific ethos and scope of Minerva, and also what is it about higher education that maintains your focus?
First of all, we have always enjoyed working with clients who are driven by a sense of mission and purpose. And as well as higher education, we work with the charity sector and the cultural sector. And I think that is fundamentally important to us. I think we're both people who would be much more attracted to working with clients who have that sense of wanting to make a contribution to society than, for example, working for a sector which is more obviously driven solely by profits. I think also, we're both very curious people, and higher education is quite a unique sector to work with in the sense that over time, we will be working on senior appointments on the professional services side that cover everything from HR to marketing. But also within the academic world itself, you get the opportunity to engage with people and indulge your curiosity hearing about the work that they're doing in practically every disciplinary background. I think in addition to that, and perhaps this is the more substantive reason, it's the kind of complexity of universities themselves. I think both of us very quickly became aware of the fact that universities are complex organizations. They're organizations that, despite their scale, there are many ways in which they don't operate like corporations. And the practice of leadership to be effective in a university context, I think, has to be quite different from many other environments. And I think although it's stressful, and even as service providers, I think the challenges the sector is facing at the moment are also challenging for us. It is actually a very interesting time, I think, as the sector works its way through this cultural shift from a relatively softer funding model to being much more focused on income generation. And, we see a very interesting perspective of the challenges and the way that plays itself out in the sector.
And Kerry, Minerva's scope is broader than just the search function. Can you say a bit more about that?
I think we also felt that we really wanted to contribute to the sector beyond the transaction of searches. And we've always been very interested, as Ben's just said, in everything that goes around searches in the sector. And we felt that we'd have more time and capacity to really engage in different and exciting ways in our own business. I think one of the ways that we've evidenced that is a couple of the programs. We set up a career development program for mid-career global ethnic majority professionals, which we run once a year. It's been very successful. And that's the sort of thing that we wouldn't have been able to have the opportunity to do if we'd just been focused on searches. Similarly, the Emerging Leaders program, which I know we've now run four or five times and has also been very successful and really has enabled us to think about leadership development and career development of the people in the sector we support, as well as just engaging with people on the particular search that we're working on at a given time. I'd also say you asked about the ethos. I think that really mattered to us when we set up Minerva. I think we We recognise the sector, it's about the candidates and the clients, it's not about us actually. And I think we take a very low ego approach and do whatever we can to make sure that candidates find the best jobs for them and clients find the best hires for them. And we'll sort of do anything we can really in the background to make that work. And we're quite informal but very professional and very high quality. And I think we're very people-oriented people, and we just enjoy engaging with people in a very natural way. So we work very much in partnership with clients and candidates, and think that works best for the outcomes of the searches and other activities that we engage in.
The mini-series is focused on the stories of 4 HE leaders, each in different roles and each with a unique career path so far. But one theme that the episodes had in common was the focus that each guest had on their relationships with people and the people-focused values that underpin their leadership style. Kerry, looking at the work you do across the sector on leadership appointments, to what extent is the people aspect of leadership a quality that's increasingly being sought? And what would you say is driving that?
So I think this is really interesting because we spend a lot of our time talking about the technical expertise that candidates need for roles. And a lot of the work that we do at the beginning of a search is asking around what sort of background does somebody need to have to succeed in the role that we're seeking to fill. And actually, at the end of the day, what it comes down to is much more how somebody engages, how somebody listens, how somebody communicates, somebody's relationship building skills, the ability to empower and enable, to work with and through teams. And actually, very often in the final stages of searches, when we're comparing candidates, nobody ever mentions technical skills anymore. And it's sort of, I think the technical skills get candidates to the table, but it's the people skills that land them the role. And so what we've tried to do in a lot of the work on the career development and leadership development programs that we run is really focus on those people skills that actually are so much more important, I think, than people realise. And it's interesting, we recently briefed for a CFO search in the sector, and I observed at the end of a whole day of briefings that nobody had talked about the technical skills that somebody would need coming into the CFO role. When we were asking what people thought the organisation needed, it was all about having a really good people person, a really good relationship builder in that role. So yeah, it's fascinating. That's really fascinating.
And Ben, what have you observed to be the changes on this people focus across time?
I would say that during the 25 years I've been working with the sector, there has definitely been an increased emphasis on candidates being able to show these people skills to be taken seriously. And indeed, there's been quite a lot of increased thinking about values and motivation and purpose, and discussions around areas such as authentic leadership, which I don't think were there when I started working with the sector, where things felt like they were much more transactional. But at the moment, I think also there is a sense in which we're often looking for very specific sets of skills around people. And I think the strongest candidates are the ones who are presenting credible narratives of delivering change. And I think nearly all of the roles that we recruit to have this very strong emphasis on realizing some sort of change, which of course is about positive developments. It is about taking things forward, but it's very often also about taking some difficult decisions and having the resilience to work with teams to deliver cultural change, which is going to be quite painful for groups of staff, and also result in people leaving and new people joining. So I'd say at the moment, it's a window where it's a particularly hard sort of type of people skills which are being particularly sought.
Thinking about the picture you've described there, what are your thoughts about how well the sector's supporting the development of emerging leaders in that people aspect of leadership? Because I guess, quite a lot of that has to be gained surely through experience rather than the theory.
Sitting from the sidelines and working with candidates over the sort of 20 years or so that TMP, for example, has been running, there's a slight sense that a lot of the resources for leadership development in the sector have been focused on the people who already have, if you like, crossed over a threshold and are probably kind of most of their way to the top by the time they enter the kind of leadership development program. And for us, and we worked for a number of years with Mary Stewart, the former Vice Chancellor of the University of Lincoln, on developing an emerging leaders program, because really of an interest in the fact that a lot of the most difficult change and developments are expected to be delivered by people who are at deputy director or director level or head of school dean level. And I would observe that over the years I've worked with the sector, that often seems to be the point where some of the most talented people will pull out of continuing in leadership roles because they enter into those roles not as well prepared for them as they might be. They discover that having difficult conversations with people who used to be their peers and friends is more challenging than they thought it would be. And there are certain practices around delegation and around sharing workload, or around finding ways of ensuring that you can begin to operate strategically in a role like that, as opposed to being simply down in the weeds and fighting fires. And I think a lot of good people kind of opt out of leadership at that level, and they say, well, you know, if they're academics, I'll just focus on my research and go back to the lab or whatever. Or in professional services, you know, also they'll sort of moderate their ambition about continuing to progress because they've been exposed in roles where they're not as well equipped as they might be. And the Emerging Leaders Programme was really something that we worked on as a way of supporting people through that stage, in the hope that sort of we would be playing our part in helping with the next generation of people coming forward.
And another theme that threaded through the earlier episodes was some of the challenges that guests had experienced along their career paths. And I mean, I think it was important to profile that because it is, of course, really easy to assume that colleagues in leadership positions just breeze through into those posts. Kerry, one challenge that will happen to nearly everyone in their career is applying for a role and not getting it because they don't have the right experience. What are your observations about the right experience that institutions are now seeking from colleagues applying for those leadership positions?
Ben and I and our colleagues at Minerva spend a lot of time with candidates, helping them through those really difficult moments when they've just found out they haven't been shortlisted or they haven't got a job that they were really hoping to get. And sometimes there are real frustrations around particular types of experiences that clients have been looking for. And obviously it does depend from role to role, but I think it's fair to say there are a few generic experiences that clients look for. And I think one of those is line management experience. I think people can get quite a long way in their careers, especially if they come up sort of thematic roles, without actually having run a department or run a function or run a faculty. And you get to a certain stage, it can be quite difficult to get the next job if you haven't actually if you can't show that the buck has actually stopped with you for a department or a division. And that can be very frustrating for people. I think it can be very nerve-wracking for clients to take a punt on somebody for a big role when they've never been a dean or a head of department. Another one I'd say is scale of experience. And I know that's very frustrating for people, especially if they come from smaller organisations and are applying for a job in a larger organisation. And there's just this sense on panels that if they haven't had scale, they're just going to be a risk in the role. And there's not much you can do about that as a candidate if you've been in small organisations. I suppose you need to think strategically about moving around earlier in your career, but not everyone can do that. So that's something we're very aware of. I think another one is how much people have moved around. I mean, we always say that it never looks good if people have moved on very, very often throughout their whole career. On the other hand, it doesn't look good if somebody's stayed put for the whole of their career. So getting that balance right can often be something that clients judge, I think, and look at quite closely. There's also this issue of jumping a level. I think in the past, it was much more acceptable to be going for a job that looked to be significantly more senior than the one that you were in at the time, or and also jumping a function. I mean, I think there was much more open-mindedness previously when we came into this industry for people who might have done something different to what the job that they're applying for is, but actually that could be fine. And I think nowadays it's much harder to go for a particular role if it doesn't look as though your career has been leading to that sort of role. So I think all of these things point to a risk aversion, actually. I just think the sector has become much more risk averse, much more conservative, and it's always easier to go with somebody who looks as though they've done something very similar to the role and where it's less of a risk.
And Ben, what reflections do you have about that emerging risk aversion Kerry mentioned there?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that Kerry's making, because I think if we think back over the last couple of decades, one of the most successful vice chancellors that the country had was Eric Thomas, who was vice chancellor at Bristol for a number of years and who leapfrogged from being dean of medicine at the University of Southampton straight into the role. And, I think that would be very, very unlikely to happen in the current climate, in that, nearly all of the candidates who are shortlisted for these roles are long-standing DVCs in institutions. And I suppose, sort of broadening out the question a bit, I think that there's, ultimately the most significant decision that's made about leadership in a university is the appointment of a vice chancellor. And this is very often made by a group of lay representatives from the university council or governing body. And of course, the institution then is susceptible to the depth of reflection and understanding and humility that those individuals have about the decision that they are tasked with making. And I think we all know, those of us who've been involved with the sector for a number of time, that that's a very mixed picture from institution to institution. And I think one of the things that is a challenge for the sector is that whilst there's an increasing reflection on what leadership might look like, I don't think that there's a lot of reflection about what does leadership look like in the context of higher education, and sort of what are the sorts of people, what are the sorts of qualities that staff and academics within institutions will enjoy following. Because it isn't always the sort of charisma and the sort of style that perhaps many of the lay people on university councils and boards are familiar with from their own professional lives. We see this with a lot of the work that we do with people, both at the emerging leaders and at some more junior levels now, particularly people coming from more diverse backgrounds, which is that one of the things I think universities sort of are uncomfortable with themselves about is actually how political they are as organizations internally. And it strikes me, from having seen the progression of certain people over the years, that universities are susceptible to the people who are best at managing upwards, making the right noises, building visibility for themselves. And the sort of the adage of the squeaky wheel gets the grease is sort of seems very familiar, in that I think there are also a lot of people who in the university sector who go into the sector because they see it as being an environment which may be less political than other environments. And it's the content of the roles that attracts them, as opposed to the idea of being successful in a large organizational environment. And it can be quite challenging for people who are doing their jobs expertly well to find ways of authentically networking within the organization, sticking their head above the parapet and becoming more visible. And in some of the courses that we do with people coming from global ethnic majority backgrounds, it's particularly the case that if you don't feel that you have the passport to be able to present yourself easily within the organization in that way, it takes a lot of additional work to kind of stand out more. And I think this is a really interesting challenge for people who are looking to develop their careers.
Being in a leadership position is a highly exposed role, especially in the vice-chancellor or principal job. It requires a high level of resilience to respond to that setting. And just to illustrate that point a bit more, Ben, you co-wrote an article in Wonky a few years ago, which included a quote from a vice-chancellor who said, "I don't think anyone prepared me for quite how much everything I did would be interpreted as relating to the university. If I'm walking around looking puzzled because I'm wondering what to have for my tea tonight, that's interpreted as being about the university." Now, there's probably many HE leaders at all levels, vice-chancellors, registrars, deans, who can strongly identify with their every move being observed. Kerry, what are your thoughts about the resilience aspect of HE leadership roles in the current climate? And how are you seeing that pan out in recruitment?
So this is something that Ben and I talk about a lot. There are definitely fewer senior level people in the sector, deputy vice chancellors, who want to be a vice chancellor. There are just lots of conversations we have with people where they say, actually, that's not for me. I've seen that close up. I can see what that looks like, and that's not for me. And that's interesting because I think, again, years ago, I think it was sort of understood that if you were a deputy vice chancellor, you were on your way to being a vice chancellor, and you'd sort of already made that decision. And actually, people are opting out at that level, I think, now increasingly. And I think the other interesting thing there is it's sort of okay to say that, and people aren't judged to be unambitious because they've decided that actually they don't think they've got it in them to be a vice chancellor, or it's not where their priorities are for their lives. And I think we've all seen lots of examples of just how battering those roles are, and they're pretty much 24/7, and you never know what's going to come, and you're only an email or something away from the front page of a newspaper, and it's sort of constant pressure. And I think there's just an understanding that's not for everybody. And actually, work-life balance and priorities, particularly since COVID, I think there's a real understanding that people have different priorities for their lives and careers, and that's okay. And actually, I think that's a really good development. I think actually it's sort of okay.
Ben, it's a few years since that wonky article was written, but what reflections do you have about it in terms of what Vice Chancellors shared with you?
Yeah, and it is a number of years since we did the interviews for that report, although I still remember very clearly how vivid a lot of the narratives were that the Vice Chancellors gave us. I mean, some of them in favour of actually making the point that in spite of everything that was changing, they still felt that universities were actually really good environments to work in and build careers in. And one of the interesting things was the amount of optimism that generally speaking they had about the sector and the reasons for being involved with it. But there were a few cases, in particular one Vice Chancellor who talked very, very clearly about the struggles they were having with what was being written about them on the internet by anonymous members of the institution. And, they were just talking about very kind of human struggles, such as making sure that after the second glass of wine, they didn't make the mistake of going upstairs and seeing what comments had been written about various news articles and things like that. And I think it's very easy to forget, actually, that particularly in the top job, there is a kind of small person behind that role who has a mixture of things going on in their life and a mixture of vulnerabilities in the same way that everybody else does. It's very easy to sort of simply be critical, I think.
And you mentioned a few moments ago about governing bodies. I mean, the HE environment is increasingly challenging and visible for governing bodies too, especially with the regulatory responsibilities under the Office for Students. What impact would you say, Ben, that setting is having on finding potential new governing body members?
Huge. And we receive an increasing number of invitations to put in proposals to help recruit governing body and council members in situations where 2 or 3 people have resigned at once. 10 years ago, that never happened. It was always very kind of programmatic. And indeed, actually, 10 years ago, it was relatively unusual that a university would use a search firm to recruit people to sit on their governing body or council. And I think that there was a period of time, probably after fees got brought in, when it was really obvious that governance was getting quite kind of skittish. And then it calmed down again. But I would say that there's definitely a sense that it's feeling much more pressured. At one level, I wonder whether actually we need a bigger rethink about what the purpose of governance is, because I think following regulations and thinking about it from a compliance point of view, primarily, which is where I think a number of boards are still stuck, is fine in a situation where money is flowing quite freely. And what you need to be doing is checking that nothing untoward is happening. But when you're in a situation where actually quite a lot of the organizations in the sector are facing quite serious questions about what should they continue doing, what should they pull out of, what does sustainability look like, what does strategy look like, it seems to me that we need to have a much more kind of collaborative approach to governance, where the board sits essentially on the same side of the table as the executive, and they are a group of people working together to develop and deliver strategy. I think that some of the tenor in the past few years from the regulatory bodies has not helped with that, because I think it has responded to perhaps some earlier government attempts to kind of restrict or some sense that the government felt that they had to bring the sector into line. I think it does feel a bit like things are working towards a slightly more sensible tone. The thing that's more striking than it ever was is how dependent they are on the tenor and approach of the chair. And I think that having somebody who is mature enough and really good at handling the multiple facets of being an effective chair of a board has become more important in the sector in a way that I don't think it ever was before. We talk a lot when we're pitching for work about the fact that the majority of governance in the sector is still pro bono. It's still possible to help to find people and recruit people on the basis of it being pro bono. But I think there is a sense that the sector's running out of time, given the complexity of the requirements now for this to continue being the case. And I suspect that it will have to become like the NHS or the housing sector and some other areas and think about how people who contribute in this way are what sort of exchange is provided.
You've just talked there about the challenges of being in HE at the moment, and we know the sector's evolving, and how it may look in the next few years could be radically different to what it is now. Kerry, what are your thoughts about what that context means for leadership search in the medium terms? And what factors do you think will become increasingly important for institutions recruiting leaders, but also for colleagues contemplating leadership roles?
It has changed. I mean, Ben and I reflect on this a lot. Our conversations with clients and candidates have really changed over the years. And I mean, one of those is hybrid working, actually. I mean, I don't think we have a first candidate call on a search. I don't think we ever get beyond 5 minutes without the question being asked, what are the hybrid working arrangements? Is there any flexibility in the role in terms of how many days on campus? And that's actually become quite a sort of theme in our searches now. And certainly when we report back to clients on candidates, it's along with the other sort of the other classic things that we're asked about location and salary, all the sort of practical things. It's how's it going to work? Would they relocate, or will it be a hybrid role? And from the candidate's perspective, I think it also does determine the roles that a candidate will go for. I mean, very often a candidate will say to us, they only really want to be on campus now 2 days a week, and that will be a criterion in their job search. So that's one thing that's really changed since COVID. I mean, I think another one is that there is just much more mobility and understanding of mobility. So I think there's a lot more of a sympathy for people needing to move for reasons other than just their own career, whether that's caring responsibilities, whether that's dual careers. And there's an understanding that actually that feeds into somebody's job search in a way that, I mean, 10, 20 years ago, people just wouldn't have spoken about those sorts of things. There's also an understanding that people will leave a role if they're not happy. The sort of life's too short phrase that we hear quite a lot. I think people are quite quick to recognise if it's not working or if they're not happy, they'll leave. Whereas when I started in this industry 20 years ago, you sort of had to be in a role for 5 years, really. Otherwise, it was career suicide. You couldn't leave, however awful it was. You sort of had to stay once you'd embarked on a role. So all of those things, I think, are really mature. The other thing I think I'd say is motivation. Clients are much more interested to understand somebody's motivation. And actually, to Ben's point a minute ago about pro bono governance, I think people are almost suspicious as to why somebody would want to do it unless there's a really good reason why somebody's interested in that organisation, or there's something they can point to which reassures the client that they really do want a pro bono governance role that's going to take up a significant chunk of their time. So we spend a lot more time, I think, looking at cover letters. And I would say now panels are much more interested in the content of a cover letter than a CV, and sort of hearing it from the candidate, in the candidate's own words, what they think they'll bring and why they're interested. So I think that there's much more of a focus on that. And then the final thing that I will say, and we talked about this earlier, is that there's definitely a need for people to be able to evidence experience rather than ability in going for a role. And I think that has interesting implications for the sector, because I think there probably is less space for creativity in appointments. I think there's such a nervousness, and somebody has to have done certain things, as we discussed earlier, in order to be credible for a role, that there isn't the space for the imaginative hire coming from sort of left field. It's much less openness to consider somebody like that, and it's just, I don't know, are we all becoming a bit conservative?
And Ben, what are your reflections?
It's a slightly different tack, but I think one of the things that we reflect on quite a lot is, and we've talked quite a bit about culture in this, and there are certain aspects of sort of perhaps what universities have held dear about their culture, which are potentially at risk at the moment as the sector goes through these challenging times. And we see aspects of it through a particular lens, in the sense that we deal with people at all levels of an institution. And many of the service areas that we deal with are clearly, in a lot of institutions, sort of cut back in quite significant ways at the moment. And there's a kind of tightness of resource. But also we can see that in the way that we interact with and the interactions we receive from people within a number of these service areas, that people are under a lot of pressure and stress at the moment. And whereas I would say there was a sort of default setting of collaboration and politeness, people are quicker to sort of lose their temper and move into kind of situations of blame, as opposed to sort of thinking through how can we all solve the problem together, which I think used to be the case. And I just wonder if there's a risk that the sector will need to do things over time to kind of redress some of that and ensure that some of the kind of holistic elements of the culture are preserved. I think also it's worrying, and I think it will be interesting to see how universities deal with over time. But we work with a number of institutions where they're exploring joint venture models or subsidiary companies, and sometimes these are being used as ways of employing new professional services staff. I haven't seen it being applied to academics, only professional services staff. And obviously, one of the aspects of this, presumably it's sort of less unionized in conditions, more flexibility around salary, and particularly kind of reduced pension burden. Clearly, there are business reasons for doing that, and the economics might make sound sense, but it will be interesting, and I sense problematic to see how this plays out over time in terms of the cultures within sector. And one of the big themes for the 25 years I've been working with universities has been about creating collaborative working between academics and professional services staff and putting people on an equal foot. And I think, we're coming across a number of institutions which are structurally doing the opposite of that. It'll be a challenge to see how that plays out, I think.
Finishing up our conversation, courage or being courageous are words that I think thread through the mini-series. Being courageous to step into leadership and to lead change, having courage to meet its opportunities and challenges, as we've been talking about, and to lead the future of the sector. What reflections do you have, Kerry, about what you've heard from the guests featured in the mini-series that inform the future leadership of higher education?
So it's interesting, when I was, with each one I've listened to, each of the podcasts I've listened to, I was thinking to myself, it's interesting, courage comes up all the time, and I think that's right. I mean, I think you need huge courage to do these jobs. And yet I reflect that the sector and society, perhaps more generally, actually, is putting more and more systems into place that actually are designed to quash courage. I mean, there's so much more regulation, there's so much more compliance, there's so much more sort of restricting people's movements. And yet we're asking people to be courageous. It's interesting, really, isn't it? The systems aren't lending themselves to that at all. But the podcast series has focused a lot on courage. I think our conversations with candidates focus a lot on courage. And interestingly, it was good timing with today's podcast coming up. I was talking to a candidate yesterday about a role who's decided to withdraw. And when I just asked why, she actually said, I don't think I'm brave enough for this job. That's good timing with today's meeting. But it's really hard, I think, because people see the courage of others being eroded because of the systems that we put in place, or we have put in place.
And Ben, what reflections did you have?
For me, I sense that the sort of white light that guided all of the people that you've interviewed throughout their careers was their own kind of values and mission and purpose. And during their journeys, none of them seem to have lost that. And they've retained a deep sense of why they're in the sector, what they're committed to. And I think this is, for me, again, thinking at the governance level, but in fact, I think it's true at all levels of the sector, which is at a time when resources are scarce and when we're fighting to think through what the purpose is, or when we're fighting to think through what sustainability looks like and what the future looks like, I think it's more important than ever to think about what the mission and purpose is and to start from that, and have that as the guide for how everything moves forward. And I think that needs to be protected kind of in the face of an impetus towards making decisions kind of primarily on the basis of money and resources.
Kerry, Ben, thank you so much for Minerva's support for this mini-series and for sharing your own reflections in this episode.
Thank you very much.
Job Shadowing HE was written and presented by Susanna Marsden, and you can find out more information about her consultancy work at susannamarsden.co.uk. Audio production and music was by me, Rodri Marsden. Find out more about this podcast and hear previous episodes at jobshadowinghe.com.